Hello, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable discussion today, Gendered Harm, the Disproportionate Impact of Biological and Chemical Weapons on Women and Girls. Women in International Security, also known as WIIS, is proud to host the event today with the Embassy of Liechtenstein. My name is Ariella Blatter, and I'm here as President and CEO of WIIS. Let me tell you a little bit about WIIS today. It is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality and by helping women advance as leaders in the international peace and security sector. For over 35 years, our unique global membership organization has supported professional growth opportunities for women, led gender equality projects in research, policy engagement initiatives, and nurtured a community of powerful security advocates, experts, leaders, and mentors. Our network spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents, and we are looking forward to working with you today in these kinds of discussions across a range of topics. And if you're interested in learning more about the organization and joining us as a member, please visit our website. The link will be in the chat today. We're particularly excited about our discussion today because in April of last year, WIIS took the first step in looking more closely at the relationship of gender and gendered harm across the broad range of weapons, both conventional and unconventional, with the discussion on gender and nuclear weapons and small arms and light weapons. Today, we continue that conversation with experts in chemical and biological weapons and find new ways of acknowledging the gendered impacts of these weapons and possible ways of advancing the policy debate and outcomes in the field. I am grateful to His Excellency Georg Sparber, Ambassador of Liechtenstein to the United States, for his strong support of WIIS's mission, and I invite him and welcome him to our discussion today. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists, Grizel Rodriguez, Christina McAllister, and Dr. Dana Perkins. I'm now delighted to welcome and introduce His Excellency Georg Sparber, Ambassador of the Principality of Liechtenstein to the United States. Prior to becoming appointed to Ambassador to the United States in 2021, Ambassador Sparber held the position of Deputy Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York since January 2017. His portfolio includes disarmament, peace and security, and political issues. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ariella, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for your kind introduction and for co-hosting today's event with us. As you mentioned, this is the continuation of a discussion that we've had last year, and is certainly a topic from our point of view that is only growing in importance. There are, without any doubt, very significant gendered impacts associated with the development, use, and also the threat of the use of chemical and biological weapons. I hope today's event can contribute a little bit to make these impacts more visible. Research certainly points to different levels of harm to men and women, girls and boys, from biological chemical weapons, not only on the physical level, such as in reproductive health, for example, but also on psychological and social levels. Very useful work is being done by the United Nations, by think tanks, and by academic research on this. And I really do look forward to hearing more from our excellent panelists on what the lay of the land is. I do believe it is particularly useful to not only look at and understand the gendered impacts of the chemical and biological weapons we know of, but also to analyze how the design of new weapons exploits specific gendered impacts. And I want to be very clear on this here. Of course, all of this is illegal under international law, not only, but in particular under the relevant UN conventions. There's another aspect of today's discussion that I hope will be particularly useful, and that is that it brings together a panel of experts that combine very deep know-how on the technical aspects, but also on how to translate that into advocacy and normative change. We need all the 3 dimensions to come together for there to be real impact and real change. And it is also an area where I believe WIIS can make a key contribution to translate that knowledge that we have into normative change that we need. The opportunities to do so will come later this year in the framework of the meeting of states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. and also the Conference of States Parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And there is, of course, always a number of relevant United Nations negotiation tracks to achieve that objective. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here with us today. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise, and I really look forward to the discussion and hand it back to you, Ariela. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate your remarks. We do look forward to laying the groundwork about gendered harm, but pushing the envelope to talk about emerging weapons, and to, of course, remind ourselves about, again, we're talking about weaponry in an illegal framework. And so I would like to turn to Dr. Jana Wattenberg, who is a non-resident fellow at Women in International Security. She artfully moderated our discussion in April and will do so again. So Dr. Wattenberg, the floor is yours. Please take it from me.
Thank you so much, Ariela, and thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be part of this second part of these events, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. As we turn to the rest of our program, I would like to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of our panelists. Please let me first introduce Giselle Rodriguez. She is counselor and part of the Panamanian delegation of the permanent mission of the Republic of Panama to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. It is wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your thoughts with us today, Councillor Rodriguez. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you Christina McAllister. She is the director of the Partnerships and Proliferation Prevention Program at the Stimson Center. Welcome, Christina McAllister. It is great to have you here today. And finally, please welcome Dr. Dana Perkins. She is Senior Science Advisor with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And she's also a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. A very warm welcome to you too, Dr. Perkins. Thank you all so much for being here. I invite the audience to please review the amazing and fascinating and very inspiring bios of all of our speakers that you, I think, can find in the chat. And please use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have for our panelists as they start to present their responses to our questions. As a first question, I would like to ask all of our panelists to respond to the question, in what way is the impact of weapons gendered? So in what way can we consider weapons impact gendered, and how, or if at all, has this impact been acknowledged in arms control and disarmament debates and treaties? So I'll kind of invite you each to give a brief response to this question. Councillor Rodriguez, the floor is yours for your first thoughts on this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana, and good morning, Excellencies and distinguished colleagues. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Women in International Security and the Embassy of Liechtenstein for organizing this virtual discussion and for giving me the privilege to be part of this esteemed panel. I will focus my remark on the gender impacts of biological weapons since it is related to my field of work. While biological weapons are by nature indiscriminate, their effects can be felt differently by women, men, girls, and boys as a result of biological differences, as well as socially constructed gender norms and inequalities. The gender dynamics, as well as the way they intersect with factors such as age, race, ethnicity, origin, and disability, influence the exposure to pathogens and infection, the likelihood of becoming a survivor, the vulnerability to discrimination and social stigma, the level of knowledge and education, access to information and decision-making opportunities, the ability to seek medical assistance, treatment and reporting cases, and the long-lasting physical and psychological impacts of these weapons, including post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, studies suggest variation in levels of mortality and vulnerability between men and women to some diseases or biological agents, as well as reproductive health issues and obstetric complications, including miscarriages, birth defects, and male infertility. In the case of battlefield use of biological weapons, men are more likely to be exposed as they comprise the majority of combatants. In the event of an attack on a civilian population, women, and in many cases girls, would likely face an increased risk of exposure given their predominant roles and caregivers within families and communities and as frontline healthcare workers. Potential contamination from biological weapons can lead to prolonged and short-term population displacement, which in conflict situations could put women and girls at higher risk of sexual and gender-based violence and make them dependent on others for help and safe passage. In many societies, women and girls face greater obstacles to healthcare services and recovery, protection, and assistance. The WIIS does not have any gender-related provision, but since 2019, there has been an increased attention to gender considerations within the convention, including statements at the WIIS-related meetings, research on potential sex-specific effects and gender impacts of biological weapons, side events, and informal exchange exploring the relevance of gender perspectives in the BWC. So gender is becoming a topical issue for the BWC regime. The UN General Assembly Resolution 74/79 on BWC, adopted in 2019, have incorporated for the first time a preambular paragraph encouraging the equitable participation of women and men in the framework of the convention. This inclusion was retained in its 4 subsequent resolutions. However, none of these texts acknowledge the differentiated effects of these weapons. So far, none of the outcome documents of the meeting of states parties or the review conferences had referred to gender considerations. Against this background, since 2021, Panama has been submitting at the BWC a working paper on enhancing gender equality and women's empowerment, which aim to raise awareness about the chronic and systemic nature of gender inequality that has characterized this forum and the need to examine the gendered impacts of biological weapons. The working paper presents in a non-exhaustive manner some practical proposals for the application of a gender lens in all areas of the BWC, including international cooperation, science and technology, national implementation, response and preparedness, verification, and institutional arrangements. In the last BWC review conference that took place in 2022, efforts were made to ensure gender mainstreaming in its machinery and processes in a sustainable manner, included in the Solemn Declaration, the review article by article, and in the intersessional program. But proposals on gender and on other subject matters were not reflected in the outcome document due to the geopolitical juncture in which the review conference took place. Nevertheless, the current cycle provides a unique opportunity to further galvanize momentum within states parties and interested stakeholders in order to achieve progress and tangible outcomes in that regard in the 10th review conference that is scheduled no later for 2027. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Grisel. I have like 1,000 follow-up questions on this already. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and like views and experiences of what has been happening already so far. Thank you. Christina McAllister, I'm very happy to hand the floor over to you now.
Thanks very much, Jana. And thank you to Women in International Security and to the Embassy of Liechtenstein for having me on this panel. It's I really am honored to be in such a distinguished company and appreciate the opportunity to participate in a really interesting discussion. So I will just repeat some of the points that Grisel has already made and add perhaps a few from the perspective of the Chemical Weapons Convention, but just to revisit what we mean by the impact of weapons being gendered. I think in the context of this discussion, I believe we're looking at how weapons have a different effect depending on the physical and biological characteristics that differentiate males and females, as well as the different impact that they have based on different social norms that societies assign to men and women. They're what we think of as their traditional or socially accepted roles and activities for men and women. You know, some perhaps most saliently, you know, men traditionally have been on front lines of conflicts and wars. But I'll take a line from the Arms Trade Treaty, which notes that civilians, particularly women and children, actually account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed conflict and armed violence. In terms of, you know, sex-related impacts, women may be more sensitive to some vaccines. They may have better health outcomes in some cases. Men may be have higher morbidity or mortality rates from different biological or chemical agents. And both sexes may, well, female sex may experience pregnancy-related issues, and both sexes may experience fertility impacts from these biological and chemical agents. Both sex and gender lenses are very important, but I would agree with Grisel, neither is taken into account much, if at all, by the two key treaties that we're here to consider today. Grisel very ably addressed the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Similarly, the Convention on Chemical Weapons, which came into force in 1997, similarly does not address gender or sex-related impacts at all in its language. We do, as Grisel noted, we do hear in the context of both treaties, meetings of states parties, we do hear national statements refer to the importance of a gender perspective. There are side events that deal with gender and sex impacts of these weapons. There have been some notable concrete suggestions on how to promote gender equality in the discussions, in the delegations that attend the meetings of state parties, that have a discourse on disarmament and arms control, and how to infuse gender and sex considerations into the research on the impact of these weapons. I want to second the Panama submitted their proposal on enhancing gender equality and women's empowerment as an integral part of the institutional strengthening of the Biological Weapons Convention. It's a very great contribution to that forum. And in terms of the Chemical Weapons Convention, Canada has presented a working paper at last year's 5th review conference on gender equality, diversity, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Again, as a starting point for a deeper conversation about those issues in the context of the convention. But I think overall, there's significant room for growth and strengthening in this area. If we just look at the Arms Trade Treaty as just one example, there's actual language in the treaty about gender and those impacts. And I think there's a lot more room in the context of these two treaties to do more. So thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Jana, at this point.
Thank you so much, Christina. And yeah, I really appreciate the comparison between different treaties and what we can learn from how gender has been brought into these discussions and texts in other areas. Thank you so much. So I would suggest, Grisel, we move back to you. And I took a lot of notes while you were speaking. And I wonder if, as the next question, you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the role of international organizations and really pushing the conversation on gendered harm. How important are conversations that take place in spaces like the United Nations? What has, in your experience, worked really well? And perhaps you could also reflect on where are things still really difficult in utilizing these spaces to really push our thinking about the gendered harm of weapons. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jana. Let me maybe first start with the part of the role of international bodies. And I just want to recall that in his 2022 report on women and peace and security, the UN Secretary General notes that concerns about biological weapons use are heightened, but are rarely discussed or handled with sufficient gender analysis. This is something that also Christina mentioned in her remarks. And indeed, sex-specific effects and gender impacts of biological weapons have scarcely been studied. More data and research by international bodies like the UN are needed to better understand these aspects, raise awareness, and help states to build more effective, resilient, and inclusive public health interventions, targeted responses, and recovery subsequent to the use of biological weapons or even chemical weapons. In this regard, lessons learned could be drawn from historical examples of biological warfare and natural outbreaks of diseases, such as the Ebola outbreak, Zika virus, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The UN and other international and regional organizations, in collaboration with other stakeholders, such as civil society organizations, academia, and the scientific community, should lead efforts to address the lack of gender perspective and analysis, as this situation can reinforce and perpetuate existing biases in scientific research and innovations in science and technology, including the development and application of medical countermeasures such as diagnostics, vaccines, treatments, therapeutics, and personal protective equipment. The sex-specific effects should be considered in all UN guidelines and recommendations for medical countermeasures, including vaccination against agents used in biological warfare, and bring together a network of researchers and different specialized agencies to develop a generic framework for the provision of assistance that includes gender-related considerations. It will be important that fact-finding missions and other investigative processes, such as the UN Secretary General's mechanism for investigation of alleged use of chemical and biological weapons, work with disaggregated data that could be used to build a better understanding of the differentiated impacts of biological agents among women, men, boys, and girls. International bodies like the UN should provide and support capacity building programs, including traineeships, fellowships, and mentorship programs to develop technical expertise and political skills among women diplomats and scientists, particularly young women from developing countries. This type of initiatives plays a key role to ensure equal opportunities to participate in decision-making processes at all levels, taking into account that women continue to be underrepresented in disarmament debates, particularly in leadership positions. They have not been fully incorporated into global health surveillance, detection, prevention, and response mechanisms, as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic. And moreover, women and girls face barriers in entering and progressing in the fields of life sciences, technology, biosecurity, biosafety, science diplomacy, and in other relevant fields right from their school years. And also it would be important to promote more synergies between relevant organizations, such as the World Health Organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the Organization for Animal Health, and also the ISU of the BWC. But at the same time, we should remember that we are not here creating the wheel when we are referring to gender equality and the importance to acknowledge the gender impact of weapons, because this is very much related to the implementation of international obligations and commitments, including, for example, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially the SDG 5 on gender equality, and the SDG 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies and institutions, and also the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, among others. But when we refer to gender considerations in the framework of the BWC, in overall, there seems to be a broad support and flexibility for advancing discussions on the issue in the current cycle. But coming back to your question about possible obstacles in acknowledging these impacts, I would say that despite this flexibility, one of the main challenges will be to achieve consensus on how to address these questions, since there are differences of view in this regard, even between national authorities. For example, sometimes the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are more supportive of gender equality and diversity than the Ministry of Defense, who are often the focal points for the implementation of disarmament treaties. Moreover, there is a reluctance and limited understanding of what gender mainstreaming means and what action might be taken at different levels. So that's why I insist that there is really an importance to count on more data, facts, and research to tackle this lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, or possible misconception. But one point that I think we could not ignore is the question of political will. And we have seen with great concern that there are gender equality, women's rights discussions are increasingly being subjected to a widespread and growing resistance and pushback and backlash in different multilateral forums. And unfortunately, disarmament has not been an exception. I remember that a few years ago, even the resolutions at the General Assembly that used to be adopted by consensus just for the fact that they have gender-related language, they were submitted for a vote. So this is, I think, that one of the main obstacles that we will need to work on from here to the next review conferences. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Grisel. And yeah, that's such fascinating points regarding kind of pushback and thinking about the progress that is often, unfortunately, not linear and straightforward when we try to bring gender into our discussions of disarmament and arms control. Thank you very much. Christina, Grisel mentioned the importance of research, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this as well. Are we doing enough to build the knowledge about the kind of gendered impacts of different forms of weapons? What have we learned so far? What do you think are kind of key findings that have been incredibly useful? And where do you still see significant gaps where we can, for instance, as researchers, also contribute to bringing these considerations more into the realms of political practice so we can aid efforts of practitioners like Grisel?
Yeah, no, I think this is such a it's a multi-part question. So I want to start with what have we learned? What do we know? And I think we know some broad brush things. We know that, and here I'm going to give a very large shout out to the work of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, which has done some really fantastic work doing some surveys of on this exact question, what do we know about the gendered and sex impacts of biological and chemical weapons? They have a great report called Missing Links, which I would recommend to participants to read and look at if they're interested in this topic to learn more. But we know, for example, that exposure to chemical and biological weapons is associated with harm to reproductive health, both men and women, that men and women have differences in susceptibility to different agents, different levels of sensitivity to vaccines. And in terms of biological incidents, there have been studies done on sex-specific and gendered impacts of some of the more recent events, particularly COVID-19. Obviously not a bioweapons attack. I'm not trying to make that point at all. Simply, it stands in as an example of a major biological event, right, for the whole world. And there's been some good research coming out of that, pointing to roughly equal case rates. But looks like some studies point to men being less likely to be tested, more likely to be hospitalized, admitted to intensive care, and experience mortality. And there's, for example, here in the States, there's the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health and Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office that have spearheaded that work. There were some other great projects that got started during the pandemic on this, the Sex, Gender, and COVID-19 project. There's a European Institute for Gender Equality. So there are resources, there are projects, there were projects looking at this. I'm not so clear on the extent to which that research continues at the moment. I simply don't know. And there's also been sex and gender related studies of the naturally caused outbreaks of Ebola in Africa, with Ebola obviously being on the list of pathogens that policymakers worry about in terms of biowarfare, but in this case, natural outbreak. And things we know in those cases that females had a higher number of Ebola cases in some countries, but also higher rates of survival. And then in terms of a systematic study of sex and gender impacts of other biowarfare agents, you can find scientific literature and clinical guidance for the treatment of anthrax, plague, and smallpox in pregnant women, for example. Again, I'm just not sure the extent to which there's really a systematic study of some of these other, if you're familiar with the select agent list, that's a very long list of things that we should be concerned about. On the chemical side, we tragically have the ongoing chemical attacks in the Syrian conflict, where studies have shown, unfortunately, associated higher rates of miscarriage with women exposed to chemical weapons agents, and correlation between exposure to mustard gas and higher male infertility rates, and similar findings from India's 1984 Bhopal chemical accident. But going back to your question about is it enough, which is really the crux of it. No, I mean it's never enough, and there are gaps, and part of the problem is I completely agree with Grisel that we're starting to see pushback on against the mainstreaming of gender into a range of discussions, but there's also an even longer standing issue with the nature of biological and chemical warfare and terrorism. We just know statistically that it's far less likely to occur than some of our more intractable public health problems. And in most countries have constrained resources. And so where do you spend your precious research dollars? How likely is it that your average OBGYN is going to treat a pregnant person with plague, right? Although, on the other hand, if we want to, as we've seen with COVID-19, if we want to be truly prepared, these are the questions that we have to consider. And there's just no way around that. I think another point that I want to make is that I think the scientific community is accustomed to studying sex-specific and gendered impacts of diseases, vaccines, countermeasures. I'm just not so sure that the disarmament and arms control and national security communities are as accustomed to thinking that way. And I thought that was a very good point that Grisel made, that the ministries of foreign affairs often are very thinking in terms of gender, and maybe the other other ministries and departments on the home front are not quite as thinking of that in the forefront of their minds. I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Jana.
Thank you so much, Christina. As an academic, always glad to hear there are gaps in the knowledge, always a great reason to think about new research projects. But thank you for that fantastic and comprehensive overview. I would like to kind of pick up on one of the last points you made that was about, we're dealing in both an environment of competing resources. There are many things we could devote our attention to. So as the next question to you both, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about why it is important that we're doing this work. So what motivates you to invest your energy into pushing for more considerations of the gender dimension of the harm of weapons? Why is it important that we're having these discussions? Why is it important that we tackle the obstacles that are still out there? I would be very curious to learn a bit about your thoughts on that question. Grisel, would you like to share some of what motivates you to do this work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jana, and also Christina, because it really complements very well our comments, and also from your experience from practitioner. But in my case is because I noticed that in the framework of conventional weapons, there have been so much progress in terms of gender considerations, particularly the Arms Trade Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention, and even in the framework of nuclear weapons, also the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. All of these instruments included provisions that acknowledge the impact on women and children, and also there's a reference on the importance of providing victim assistance that are gender and age responsive. So I thought that, of course, maybe because the conventions such as the BWC and the Chemical Weapons Convention were adopted at an earlier stage when we were not even considering the importance or make the linkage between how different, the differentiated impact of different weapons on each group of persons. And there was, of course, an increased awareness how to bring all these lessons learned and these good practices to the weapons of mass destruction regimes. And we saw that there was an interest in the Biological Weapons Convention. There were increased conversation, but it was important to take this step forward and fill the gap and to formally introduce the topic in the discussions of the BWC through a working paper. So that's how we started, and see how we in the future could ensure to have gender considerations included in the outcome document. So that was basically our inspiration of starting this conversation, but also to change a little bit the narrative from the traditional conception of security, which is quite dominated in all the debates on weapons of mass destruction, and to put it into a more focused on a human security approach. Because at the end, we have to protect our frontiers, yes, but we are talking about weapons that has cross-border impact. And we need to also think about the protection of the person. So that was one of the main reasons for us to kind of change this narrative to respond to real challenges to the 21st century.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grisel. That makes so much sense. Thank you. Christina, could you share with us your thoughts on why it is so important to continue tackling the obstacles that are out there and why it's important for us to address the gaps of knowledge that you've identified?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when you're talking about these gendered and sex-specific impacts and why that's important, it's because you're answering the questions. And I completely agree with Grisel about this human security. Who is being targeted, and who becomes a victim? Who becomes a survivor? Who is the caregiver? Like, these are the gendered impacts. Who are the caregivers? I think WHO has a fantastic resource that shows, approximately 80% of nurses around the world, generally speaking, are women, females. I think we saw during the COVID pandemic, it's women who are primarily the caregivers, juggling the teacher role and caregiving role during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And what support do they need? Who needs the access to care? Who might need to get their information in a different way, right? In order to avoid the harm or to mitigate the harm. Who is not seeking care and their care-seeking behavior, and how do we need to address that as a society? Who responds better and worse to vaccines and other countermeasures in order to adjust those countermeasures so that they do work effectively for the whole population? And then there's issues of other vulnerabilities associated with displacement and being susceptible to additional violence, to stigma. I mean, poison, when you think about chemicals, this is another point, excellent point made in the Missing Links report, that the stigma of poison is often been associated with women and issue of witchcraft. And so there's that stigma issue. It adds to these more physical issues, if you will, of the weapons. And to me, just to bring it back to what motivates, why do all these things motivate me? I think what I've learned in approaching this from different ways, including in the nuclear security sectors, looking at nonproliferation and diversity issues more broadly, is how these issues, gender and diversity, are really human issues that affect everyone. We sort of break society down into groups in order to bring it back together again as a whole in a more equitable and inclusive way. Just as a tangible example, a female former nuclear safeguards inspector mentioned in a workshop we did how male colleagues sometimes helped her with very heavy equipment they were all required to carry. Well, if you stop to think about it, is carrying heavy equipment around good for anybody's back, right? Are there better ways to address those issues that make that work more sustainable and easier to do for everyone? And then if you think about biological incidents, males or females might be more susceptible in any given scenario, but in a pandemic or epidemic, everyone is ultimately at risk. And addressing those sex and gender specific vulnerabilities is a way of looking after whole societies. Maybe women and girls are more impacted directly by the chemical attacks in Syria, but think of the enormous short and long-term consequences for their families, the broader communities. It's about sort of making the communities whole and paying attention to the ways in which those risks and effects is an important way of looking after the whole community.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. Those are so many important points that you raised. And there's, I think, an interesting tension when we think about the impact of some of these weapons, because at once their impact is non-discriminatory, they impact everyone, but then at the same time, that impact in and of itself is nuanced and might be different when we think about the impact that these weapons have on men or women and boys and girls and people who are non-conform to these gender ideals as well. So I have a question from the chat that I would like to ask you next. There's one question which is about, I'm just going to read it. With the increasing funding and growth of scientific biology and biotechnology and open science of these fields, how does this fit into the scope of biological and chemical weapons? So I think the twist I would perhaps give this is, how can we think about the developments of biotechnology and kind of scientific developments, and how do they perhaps intersect, if at all, with some of these thoughts that you're having when it comes to the gendered impact of these weapons? Or should we pay attention to this? Or is this something that you think should be separate? Any thoughts that come to your mind, please feel free to share. And that can include, perhaps that is not relevant for some of the work that you're doing. I'll leave it up to you to see who would like to go first.
Maybe I can jump in because I can use this opportunity to speak about some of the aspect of one of my recent working papers. For example, during this intersessional program, all the meetings are in the framework of the working group, aiming at strengthening the convention. And one of the focus areas is precisely the scientific and technological developments. And one of the things that we are trying to do as Panama is, because there has been always a challenge about, well, gender is not important, it's not relevant to the discussion. So we are trying to show that you can gender mainstream in all of the topics that will be addressed in the framework of this discussion. And for example, one of the concrete recommendations that we are suggesting for discussions in this topic of scientific and technological development are, for example, the need to consider gender aspects of science and technology research and development, and to monitor the advances in the field of science and technology to ensure that those do not reproduce existing gender bias, and to offer trainings for young girls and women to stimulate their interest in science, technology, diplomacy, and in other fields relevant to the BWC in order to close the gender gap, to engage in initiatives that combat harmful gender stereotypes and promote gender equality in the field of science and technology, including through the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the use of biological sciences and technology for peaceful purposes. Also to ensure that there's a gender balance mechanism to review and assess scientific and technological developments relevant to the BWC. And of course, if this mechanism is established, to ensure that there's a a mainstream of a gender perspective in the work of such mechanisms that will be mandated to review and assess scientific and technological developments relevant to the BWC. So these are our preliminary recommendations to be submitted for the consideration of the sex parties of the BWC. So we will see how this discussion will develop.
I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about how that is going to go. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. That's fantastic. Christina, do you have any thoughts kind of thinking about science and like science and technology with regards to some of the points that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is clearly one of those areas that's ripe for more research, right? That needs a lot more study and consideration and discussion. And to that, I commend Grisel for bringing that into, teeing that up for the states parties, the Biological Weapons Convention. You know, I think, again, I would agree. I think there's many things we don't know about artificial intelligence and synthetic biology, but one thing I think we do know is that it's susceptible to bias, as Grisel mentioned, and that's concerning and something that needs to be very much taken into consideration, both in terms of you know, the beneficial uses in terms of developing vaccines and countermeasures to both biological and chemical agents, and also in terms of the threat that it could pose in terms of new agents and agents working in scary ways against. And there here I haven't seen anything specific to gender, but I think the risk is not. I think the jury's out on how great a risk it poses, but the risk is not zero of these technologies targeting specific populations. So thinking about diversity more broadly, right? So yeah, back to you, Jana.
Thank you so much, Christina. As we're coming towards the end of the session, I'd like to do a quick kind of lightning round final question for my two panelists. And the question is pretty simple. You spoke so elegantly and comprehensively about all the fantastic work you're doing and thinking through the gender dimension of the harm of biological and chemical weapons. And, you know, we thought about kind of new technological developments as well. What is the one key, like if you would think about one small or big, it can be anything, problem that is really on your mind when it comes to this discussion right now, if you would narrow it in on one short priority, if you'd have a magical wish to solve that, what would it be? What would be the one thing you wish you could just magically resolve? If you could just briefly speak about that, like a short, like a key priority going forward, either in practice or in research, that would be fantastic. Grisel, I'll let you go first.
Yes, thank you, Dana. I think that awareness raising, more awareness raising to tackle the lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding, because it will help to get down certain barriers or reluctance for certain delegations to move forward this discussion. Because I think that when you use the word gender, there's a lot of misconception, and why it is important to not only speak about the gender impact, but also the sex differences, because it is not a synonym. And I think that this is part of what we need to do, like go for the basic, because for some colleagues, it looks like when we talk about gender and sex, it's exactly the same, but it is part of coming to this common understanding that will help us to move forward. And at the same time, I think that it will help to tackle the misinformation, disinformation, and all the pushback against gender equality in the different fora, including disarmament.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic key thing. If we could solve awareness raising, that would be an amazing, amazing step forward. Thank you so much, Grisel. Christina, what would be your thoughts on a key priority going forward for us?
So just one thing to think about. I found it fascinating in the context of this upcoming discussion to look at what's been going on with the negotiations over the pandemic preparedness and response accord. We've been focusing here on the Biological Weapons Convention, but obviously COVID-19 was a major biological event. All the systems and policies and processes to deal with a pandemic are also highly relevant in the event of a bioattack. And the Pandemic Preparedness Response Accord is a huge opportunity to deal with some of these issues. The current draft does not seem to deal with gender at all. Here's a chance for a completely new instrument where gender and these issues could be mainstreamed directly into the language at this point. It seemed like a disappointment that they did not reach accord by their imposed deadline of May 31st, but perhaps that's an opportunity here to get gender into the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. Thank you so much, Christina. So there was one more point in the Q&A, which I think was more of a kind of informative question or a comment that was thanking Christina for highlighting the Unity report on the missing links and reflecting on the continuous work that is happening on this issue. And there was a question whether there are any other resources that the panelists or anyone who's part of the conversation today would like to share. And if there is anything to share, please feel free to send it to us and we're happy to share it, or you can stay in touch with us afterwards as well. And so as we come to the closing of the seminar session today, I would like to thank everyone who has been coming today. I would like to thank our fantastic panelists for their comprehensive remarks that were both about practical considerations and research and awareness raising. I feel we've managed, which is very impressive thinking about the big issue that we're dealing with, to tackle most of the key components that we need to consider as we think about ways of bringing considerations of the gender dimensions of the harm of biological and chemical weapons into discussions of arms control and disarmament. So thank you so much to our two panelists. Thank you for your patience and bearing with us as we sorted out technological challenges that we had in the event in the beginning. Thank you so much, WIIS, for hosting this event. A big thanks to the whole WIIS team. And thank you, of course, to Ambassador Sparber for being here today and for giving remarks and for supporting this event. Thank you all for coming. And I wish you all a wonderful afternoon or morning or evening from wherever you'll be joining us. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.